Today I'm going to be talking about how I managed to beat both black-beard algae and staghorn algae in my 40-gallon tank. The algae start to take hold 2 to 3 months after the initial setup, but as you can see I managed to beat it and the tank's been algae free for around 4 months. Unfortunately, I tried a lot of things at the same time, but I think a combination of regular water changes, regular filter cleans and reducing the light to a 6 to 8 hour window helped the most. So starting with the things that I feel helped battle the algae, and the first one is large water changes. Initially I was using a bucket and siphon to do a regular 10 to 20% partial water change every week, but the algae outbreaks just kept getting worse. After finding a random post on Reddit of someone having a very similar problem with their tank, I noticed a lot of the people were recommending that they check their phosphate levels. I ordered a phosphate kit online and checked the levels in my tank and noticed that they were considerably higher than they should have been. Doing large partial water changes to reduce the phosphate levels with a bucket and siphon in a 40-gallon tank were just out of the question, so I picked up a Python water change system. This made things far easier, letting me do a 50 to 70% water change in a fraction of the time it would have taken with the bucket and siphon. These larger water changes did drastically reduce the phosphate levels in the tank and reduce the amount of nutrients available for the algae, essentially cutting off the food supply. If you are having problems with blackbeard or staghorn algae in your aquarium, I would recommend that you check your ammonia, nitrate and phosphate levels to see if there's any obvious problems with excess nutrients. Partial water changes can help to temporarily reduce these levels and starve the algae of food, with a Python water change system making it far easier in larger tanks. Unfortunately though, in my tank at least, this was more of a symptom rather than the root cause, and that brings me on to the next thing. I honestly do think that deep cleaning my filter on a regular basis for this tank, because it is quite heavily stocked, was one of the biggest game changers that I managed to do. Even though the large partial water changes did manage to reduce the phosphate levels, it was just temporary and I did notice that they would creep back up over a week or two. Initially, I couldn't work out what was causing this until it hit me that there's a ton of leftover fish food, detritus and fish waste sitting in the filter that could be the problem. I use an external canister filter and I see a lot of people on YouTube and social media leaving them for many months without any cleaning, and I do think that this is a mistake. After I started to deep clean my canister filter once per week, thoroughly washing all of the filter media, my phosphate levels stopped increasing after the water change, and now they are consistently within normal levels. Again, just like the water changes, this essentially starves the algae of food in your aquarium, helping you beat it as quickly as possible. So the next thing that I did was change the lighting schedule, and this tank runs on a Haiger 957 and a Nicru C10. The Haiger light has a moderate power output and the Nicru light is in the upper end of the low power output, but both lights together can kick out a decent amount of power for their price tag. Initially, I left both of the lights on their default lighting schedule that attempts to mimic the 24-hour light cycle of the sun. People often recommend you limit your tank's photo period to between 6 and 8 hours of light per day, and as I found out, this is for good reason. Thankfully, both of these lights are easy to customize, and I followed the instructions in the user manual to change the photo periods for the tank. If I remember correctly, I initially reduced it down to 8 hours of light per day, and then a few weeks later I reduced it further so the tank was getting 6 hours of light per day. I left the photo period at 6 hours of light per day until I beat the blackbeard and staghorn algae in the tank, and I did stick with that for a couple of months. After noticing some issues with my Ludwigia Mini Super Red and my Echinodorus Rennie, I have increased this to around 8 hours of light per day, and so far I haven't seen any problems with black hair algae. Just like plants, algae requires light to photosynthesize, so reducing the amount of light available can help counter the algae's ability to produce energy and help you beat it. If your tank is getting a lot of light, try reducing the photo period to 8 hours per day as an absolute maximum and see what happens to the algae. Thankfully, both of my lights had a timer chip built in, so it was easy to change their default programming to do this for me. If you do have a manual light with a switch, then you can get a smart plug and use the app to control how many hours of power it will give the light, and then you just leave the switch on the on position and let the plug's automated on-off function deal with the photo period. Now this next one is optional, but I do think that it helped, and that was adding a Siamese algae eater to the tank. I want to be clear on this one, and I honestly think that the algae in here was already on its way out by me cleaning the filter, doing regular water changes and reducing the photo period for the tank. On top of that, these are quite big fish, so a 40-gallon tank is the absolute minimum that I would recommend for them, and even then they can be better in larger tanks. Now my Siamese algae eater was absolutely tiny when I first got it, and I thought it would be useless, and for the first few days it really didn't do much, but once it felt safe there was absolutely no stopping it, and it would constantly be ripping algae off the surfaces and eating it. The final thing that I think helped beat the algae in this tank was adding a bunch of Rotala rotundifolia to the background and adding a lot of floating plants to the tank. My theory was that this would help soak up the excess nutrients in the tank and outcompete the algae for food, essentially starving it. I do think that this strategy did help initially, but its effectiveness probably was reduced once I started doing regular water changes and filter cleans. Still, Rotala rotundifolia and Salvinia are cheap plants that are easy to find in stores and very easy to propagate. If you do have excess nutrients in your tank, but for whatever reason you can't do regular large water changes or filter cleans, then this could be a way to beat the algae. So moving on to things that I tried but I don't think really helped to fix the algae in the tank. The first one is Neocaridina shrimp, and I do love these guys, but I honestly think they were just grazing on the biofilm that grew on top of the blackbeard algae rather than the actual algae itself. My Neurite snails seem to do something similar, and they'd work around the algae and graze on the biofilm grown on the hardscape in the tank. The Ammonia shrimp did seem to help a little bit, but they definitely prefer other food sources to these types of algae, so if there's anything else in the tank they're just going to go off and eat that instead. The next one is Flourish XL, and I actually used this one in my 29-gallon tank rather than my 40-gallon because it also had problems with blackbeard algae. Now this one did kind of help because it did get rid of the algae, but unfortunately some of the types of plants I used it on did also start to melt, essentially defeating the purpose. A lot of people seem to turn to products like this when they have issues with blackbeard algae, and I honestly do think that water changes, filter cleaning and lighting period tweaks can be better options. I did a bunch of research on how to use Flourish XL correctly to combat these types of algae, and I dosed it using a pipette to try and be as accurate as possible. After a couple of days, the black hair algae types did turn red, and the shrimp would then eat it because it was a lot softer than in its healthy form. Unfortunately though, after around a week I noticed that the plants would also start to melt right back, and I saw this happen on multiple plant types that I used it on. Now the melt was only localized to where I used the Flourish XL rather than the entire plant melting, but it was still a pain. Once I noticed black hair algae forming in my 40-gallon tank, I decided to only use Flourish XL as an absolute last resort, and thankfully I managed to beat it without using it in this tank. When it comes to things like this, I really do think that prevention is better than cure. Now I could be wrong, but I do think that the initial detritus spike was caused by my Helanthium telenum green carpet plants going through a melt stage and then a lot of their detritus being held in the canister filter. My tank lights were definitely on far too much at the start of this tank build, and that, coupled with the excess nutrients, did let the algae form and grow at a very fast pace. Unfortunately, we'll never know now, but I really do think that monthly deep cleans on the filter from the very start and 6 to 8 hour photo periods per day with the tank lights could have totally prevented this algae from forming in the tank. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope that it was helpful and that it's been able to help you beat blackbeard algae and staghorn algae in your own tanks. Thanks for watching and have a good day.